Hello everyone, today we talk about the conception of history during the Middle Ages, and more specifically about the change that started occurring, especially from, say, the 14th and 15th century, in conceiving history, and essentially in the way this influences us today. Right, because the topic is really big, it's very important. There's surely a lot of literature about it, about which I'm not really aware, telling the truth. But it's really important as a perspective in the first place, and it has. I've dealt a bit with part of the sources from which you can sense this shift, this change, and it can be a very useful key of interpretation of the Middle Ages, right? So, um, at this point, especially if you have been following Schwerpunkt from quite some time, that we have mm, segmented fundamentally medieval history into these successive phases of transformation, for which there is an early medieval time that is roughly not really necessarily stagnating, because really that also lasted for a very few centuries after all. But a situation that was evolving very slowly, and even given the potential involved from a strictly even material point of view. And then a central Middle Ages in which a lot of things get built up, especially at the base, at the stratum, in terms of substratum, in terms especially of political and social basis, that made Europe fundamentally stratifying and verticizing and starting to move around and extend, let's say, its range of interactions. And then there is this great revival that occurs fundamentally between the 11th and the 13th century, that is really the like an explosion in perspective of medieval civilization that really was a bit of a world on its own, that sometimes it's also very difficult to document, because albeit a lot of documentation naturally starts being produced as a consequence of this growth and expansion at the same time. They're two different things, but very importantly combined in this case. It was kind of a world on its own, something like a massive civilization that in part has fallen and transformed. The Black Death, the economical contraction that already starts actually from the second half of the 13th century, brought to open recession in some cases, does create a great contraction. Yet, as we have already observed, medieval civilization doesn't die out, doesn't have the same fate of late antiquity, or also in here there is a lot of debate, because a lot of people say, well, there wasn't even, even in there really a collapse, etc. But let's be honest about it. The ancient world, as it was in its at its acme, its greater extent, had also somewhat contracted, had not really collapsed, but its civilization transformed itself in a way for which everything was a bit put into discussion at one point, right? There was such a contraction that brought eventually the basis to be pretty simple, and therefore more easily mixable. And that's where fundamentally medieval civilization emerges from. Medieval civilization, especially at a certain point, is objectively more advanced and more powerful. It has much greater potential than the ancient one, and in fact it does evolve. Not even this massive blow that it receives in the mid 14th century is able to break it down, right? Things went on. There was, of course, an immediate drop in demographics. Also, in here, we don't truly know how much that was. The worst estimates say, like 1/3 even of the world population was wiped out. But even in here, they're kind of cliches by certain standards. But it was definitely a heavy blow. But you see that things went on, and actually, Europe progresses into the 14th and 15th century in some way to expand and to be able to look at itself, to strengthen its connections, interconnections, and also with the external world, etc., and to start expanding even outside of it, right? So what we look at as the modern age, which and also in here we will fundamentally be discussing this today, in which perspective you can consider it. But whichever thing whichever qualitative opinion you have of Middle Ages and the modern age, you realize that it was medieval civilization that transitions into something greater, right? Into something more complex, richer, that has a larger structure somehow that keeps growing and growing, right? So medieval civilization did not end; it simply transitioned into something. It was itself basically, but also in here changed but part of a system that had been successful, right, and keeps being successful without the half of a millennium, let's say, of relative contraction and stagnation that had occurred since contraction first and stagnation afterwards, mostly at the end of the ancient world. And I've already discussed in part this relation of filiation between, from the Middle Ages to the modern age, and definitely you can sense that the degree of, for example, sources production, but in general of improvement of even technological advance, is something steady, remains steady in spite of the crisis, right? So this is what I really care about, that there is a system that doesn't collapse and that goes on with all of its force, its power. The Renaissance is not a copy of the past. The true Renaissance, the healthy Renaissance, the one that really bore the richest fruits, is potently influenced by the Middle Ages. The Renaissance could have not been what we call the modern age if it hadn't passed, even in its classical knowledge, through medieval civilization. You can sense that degree of refinement, even of greater critical approach and more attemptive care for logical explanations that in fact made the late medievals or the early moderns, this Renaissance people, we can say, actually much more advanced already than classical civilization. And this is so obvious also for a strict reason of that, there is really nothing like cultural appropriation. You can learn something from another civilization and to make a profitable use of it in order to surpass it, even as it happened in the modern age, only if you are already at least at the level of that civilization, right? So this had gone far beyond. Like, we don't have to be fooled by the Renaissance perspective by saying, the Middle Ages was a dark flatland where nothing happened. This is surprisingly something that a lot of people, genuinely still believe, and this is something incredible in 2019, after all what we know about medieval times. Really, not in terms of perspective, but objectively, factually, from the evidence that we have, that it's difficult to achieve. Like, obviously, what is objective, what is factual, but we kind of understand that medieval times were more advanced from a certain point onwards, especially so than the ancient world. But why does this happen? Well, it happens for many reasons. It happens even for differences that objectively existed between several, the various parts of Europe. The Middle Ages has been told, especially in mass culture today, is echoed, etc., from certain perspectives for which effectively the collapse of the ancient world was harsher, was more brutal, and it brought to a dimension that is objectively dark, at least in the measure in which there were not sources available, right? But if you take other perspectives that are not very prevalent because of certain cultural directions we have taken now, which national perspectives you have, you see that really medieval times have been overall a time of constant progress, right? In the most neutral sense of the world, right? You can't have the insanity to pretend that fundamentally human civilization stopped during the Middle Ages. That's really insane. It's really insane, and it doesn't actually render justice to all what happened later, right? And much of the reason why people believe this is that they assume that fundamentally civilizations develop because of technologies, of theoretical know-how, while that those are just a consequence of a practical, a know-how and a practical material capability that already exists in the first place, right? You can't have a theorist if you don't have someone who has already made things work, right? You don't have the Renaissance in its treatises, in its theoretical aspect if there wasn't the, that's really the tip of the iceberg. The rest was already, like an enormous system that was already moving and was tumultuously expanding and innovating, and not because someone read a book coming from Constantinople when the Byzantine refugees from the Ottoman advance arrived into Italy or in other places. The Renaissance didn't happen in that way, and unfortunately enough, a lot of people believe this, and they do, and sometimes there are even national reasons, like thinking, well, that was my knowledge that came from somewhere where we held it, and while your world was collapsing, in fact, in front of someone else, while the rest was rocketing and surpassing you from at least 2 centuries, if for not saying 3 actually, that doesn't hold. Right, but the myth, the prejudice that the Middle Ages, there's a moment where it was so difficult to grow, everything was so slow, it was so terrible, the Middle Ages were so terrible, people were always hungry, and it was all so violent. Instead, in the other ages, nothing happened like that, right? Nobody was ever hungry, or was ever illiterate, or was ever, breaking his back all his life on a field, or wasn't killing each other. No, it seems like the Middle Ages are the scapegoat of our moral awareness. You realize that I get heated up when I talk about these things, because I obviously take them sometimes even as jokes, but it's really important to reverse this views that are still dramatically widespread, and there are also in here, I don't want to talk about it because this is not really the point I wanted to make, but it objectively passes through ignorance of the sources, right, of what we base ourselves on when we talk about history. There is this, I don't know what it's really like, but I guess this idea that there are people who like the kind of the primitivist slash tribalist slash I don't know, reactionaries idea that was such a tough world, right? For real tough men, right? That was the cool thing. Or in the other sense, there's maybe someone who thinks only about technology, says, oh well, since there was no major technological improvement, that was garbage, right? Those are the 2 prevalent aspects that are respectively kind of the obscurantist or progressivist view of history that obviously we can't throw to the bin all at once if we want to talk about history in the first place. But aside from that, I believe that looking in fact at the sources is really the most important thing. Already the idea of seeing the Middle Ages like a flatland is wrong. There are dramatic changes during the Middle Ages, and they're sometimes massive, even on the scale of a few centuries, right? It is true, everything was progressive, as we were saying before, the potential was what it was, there was no way to speed up more than once, but that's why you should take these transformations into consideration from a relative context, like, or better, from a context that is referential to what the Middle Ages were in the first place. That is to say, if you don't have the resources for doing something, how can you blame people for not having those resources? Because you know what, the only way to justify this, which is pretty stupid in the first place in general, is to say, well, because people were stupid. They didn't know how to make things work. Like those people who believed that if the Romans had implemented the Hellenic steam engine, there would have been an industrial revolution in the 2nd century AD. A person who says this basically doesn't understand anything about history of economics, history of technology, history of society in general. And which means that all across the board, right? But we're still propagating sometimes these myths. And of course, today, when there is some enlightened figure in this sense, and not all pop culture is bad. I've seen that there is a fundamental, some sort of rise of awareness of people who are more interested in accuracy, in more broadly to reliable data. But at the same time, I think it's, in spite of the increase, there is still a lot of work to do to really reverse people's minds, because we fortunately know the reasons why people reason in this way, and that's the Schwerpunkt, right? To hit. It's not about trying to make people explaining history only because of saying that's how we study the Middle Ages like today. Because if a person objectively doesn't know much about Middle Ages, they don't care, they have never read more than, I don't know, some book about it, or they just have their opinion that they will not change. The best way is to make him understand where the mistake lays within them. I mean, in the way they approach not the Middle Ages, but in general history, because that's where the problem stands, right? It's not that you have such preconceptions. It stops to the Middle Ages. It's really a broader view of history that fundamentally doesn't work. So, looking at medieval times and this change in the view of perceiving history, right? And this is an important idea, because fundamentally, when we study history, especially of certain periods of the Middle Ages, the ones that fundamentally transition a little bit from the, the early medieval times, for example, are based largely on archaeology. But they're much more similar to ancient history than the way we study them than later times. In later times, you start having a pretty massive amount of sources, like from the 13th century onwards. It's from the 14th especially, it's incredible. Like, and this is also another interesting perspective. I mean, it's not that the Middle Ages have left us more stuff because there was an iconoclasm towards certain parts of classical civilization, or that simply the medieval times are closer to us than others. The Middle Ages started to produce a huge amount of sources, like a huge amount, never been seen before. Middle Ages are the civilization of books, of machines, of thought properly meant. Remember that there is not an age in history, not even one, that has been so thirsty of knowledge like the Middle Ages were, right? Never think that we got fascinated with knowledge during the Enlightenment. The major problem of the Enlightenment was to frame correctly information. But the true love for information is something that truly only the medieval civilization has expressed at the level that we can look upon, saying, wow, these people really love to know. And they felt committed to know, because the idea is that knowing at the time was definitely exceptional, like in most ages in history. Never give for granted the fact that you can access to the internet, for example, and having literally the world knowledge open to you, much more knowledge that you can ever learn in a even in 1,000 lifetimes, while in history where people were literally risking their lives for getting to know something. So we should maybe even reconsider your positions in this sense. The medieval man also here there is a lot of debate relatively to and here we come back to the topic of history. The concept of history is that where do we learn history from? I mean, in this sense, especially in this second phase of the Middle Ages, where because also archaeological data are not infinite, and also they obviously tell us a lot about certain things, but still they don't tell us everything about certain things. So obviously I'm probably biased because I'm a historian and not an archaeologist, but telling the truth, we should be all the same. We should be the same person, just with different education. I should know much more about archaeology, by the way, and the one cannot go without the other, of course. However, I think by personal inclination, I don't know, but I like, but I think it's majority of the people like this. Let's say, I like more documentary sources. Like I love to read. I love historiography as such. I mean, as the listening to the voices of people. It's not that maybe in an archaeological find you can't literally hear the you can't see, let's say, the intelligence of someone in front of you, because you can't do it that way. But let's say for someone who has eventually to write about his history, right? Listening to someone that tells you what was going on at the time because he was hoping that you would read it as a historian, it's a hell of a thing, right? It's not that an archaeologist discovers a hidden city underground because he has to replicate one. He has to write also his own history of the thing. So historians feel, probably, at least I must say, this strong sentiment when they read about what other historians left to them, right? I believe when I read, but this way I've always been this way personally, and it's not. I don't like to be conceived as a historian because I believe that basically every person at the end of the day is a historian. I'm a historian in the measure, I mean, on paper, on a certain type of things that we study to try to understand what the world was about, let's say, and trying to improve it, to improve our understanding of it, with some attention towards aspects that seem to be more important, right? Like mostly when we study about history, we study about society at the end of the day. That's really the thing. In spite of the dreaded hyper specialization, but of course I'm joking. It's necessary and has to be. But let's say we like to get the moral of the story, right? In many ways, and you can get it from many parts. But there is one problem about when reading history is that obviously you read a source that by definition is biased, because there is not ever been a single human being on this earth that was not biased in a way or in another, right? There is nothing like an unbiased source, an unbiased historian, as an unbiased person, which doesn't mean that we all have our little agendas to pursue and so on, but it's obvious that we all have a different impression from things that happen, for our past experiences, for our view of the world, for many reasons. So even when the historian, obviously, that this is what every historian should do, tries to separate his own personal belief from, in order to understand basically what went on in this particular case, there is still the inescapable influence of many factors that come about, and it's obvious that especially when we talk about medieval history and we look at the written documents we have, most of the times, and when we read history in general, we don't read chronicles and general histories, etc., we do obviously understand that there is, first of all, an agenda, because most of, actually, if you take the ancient world or medieval world, there is nothing like a free thinking, right? This is also particularly interesting because it's in part the same reason why people probably needed to find answers, in part. So it's not pure intellectual fascination. It's also part of a society that dictated certain values and that were functional even to society at the time. Never think that what was even dogma or doctrine or imposed belief was essentially something that you can judge in the same way from the perspective of these people, because today we can afford having kind of free thinking. At the time, maybe you couldn't. I mean, what was the point? Let's be honest about it. In a world where you have certain patterns that were essentially all the same, the idea of even having a social order and etc. is fruit of a necessity, right? Obviously, if we were, and this is here where the other voice speaks up and says, but what about all those people who couldn't write, right? Or all the things, all the perspectives that objectively we don't know anything about. Do you think that we know what I don't know, 13th century peasant of the Ile-de-France thought? Nobody knows, and nobody can know fundamentally. We can make hypotheses, some better than others. We can definitely make comparative stuff, but we'll never do it and make it. It's simply because nobody knows, even what's in our neighbor's head. So it's very complicated, and it remains a mystery, and it's also probably the fuel of historical research properly meant. Yet we shouldn't ignore those perspectives. On Schwerpunkt, for example, we discussed a lot of times at this point, like 2 or 3 times or even more, the perspective of in fact, of the peasantry that we just mentioned, and you, I mean, it's pretty easy to understand that it was all another perspective of the world from that direction that we know fundamentally very few about, but that was there, and it was also the shared evidently by the wide majority of the population, right? But those people really didn't count much, even to bother themselves among the other needs that they had, of course, to write down certain things. So there is a huge problem, and for example, think about the debate that has been in French historiography. France is one of those countries, or maybe even the country that had the greatest ideological construction during medieval times, right? Being the seat of basically the largest, most powerful kingdom in Europe, especially from the 13th century onwards, it had to stress it had to justify basically and legitimize this monarchic system that was pretty big. It was pretty influential. It was based, in fact, on a pretty solidly stratified society that was in fact a feudal one, right? It was a feudal elite that effectively governed the French kingdom, and also a system that had exported it was capable to export its own political and social models all over Europe, right? This had begun pretty early in time, since Carolingian times in many ways. There is a continuity, even if, you don't have to intend it ideologically speaking, but it's obvious that, what Clovis did back in the day, it is in a way or another at the base of what the French kingdom would have become. That there is nothing teleologically into this, there is not even something strictly identitary into this, but that there are certain persistences that cannot be ignored. So for the French historians for a long time have been legitimately fascinated with this perspective that definitely produced a lot of sources, a lot of historiography that was largely apologetic towards the monarchy. You know that basically by the end of the 15th century, there was France was the country in Europe where there was a larger consensual relation with the monarchy than in other than in all the rest of Europe. We don't have time to explain how this process formed, but just saying that basically there was an equilibrium, because at the end of the day it all stems from this, that had put together the nobility, the church, and this much broader, let's say, third state made up fundamentally by the richest burghers and this aristocracy in its own regard. At the end of the day, the cities were dramatically important and also rising as centers of monarchic direction, etc. So and maybe we'll have to make a video about late, say, 15th century France. But the concept was, so what all these sources stress, they did stress the great deeds of the chivalry, of the great universalistic view of the universe as a great symbol to decipher, that was reflected on Earth and that specific political and social hierarchy. This codes, this great even knowledge, let's say, intellectual systematization of knowledge, etc. So a model that we can we can make a synthesis of by terming it universalism, right? And when you think about universalism in the medieval times, you think automatically about 13th century France, right? And that's like a compass, right? Saying, what was the process of medieval civilization compared to that, right? It's a kind of obviously an approximation. It's even a mistake by large. Nevertheless, we must, this has been criticized because, of course, there were other countries that had completely different backgrounds in many ways. They had different ruling classes. They had different cultural characteristics. They were in contact with different populations. They had, in fact, different roles within Europe. So this is all very difficult to reduce to that. I wouldn't throw away that perspective at all, however, because still, and this is something that in Schwerpunkt I think is pretty much highlighted if you read it through the lines, we do interpret, in fact, how Europe evolved, especially in its feudal character, from this broader Frankish origin, right? At least for Western Europe, but that at a certain point even surpasses the boundaries. It goes literally everywhere. There was really a big influence that specific cultural model produced. So much that even if there were different perspectives before, this one basically swallowed them, and in a certain sense permeated the most what is our picture, our perspective, our feeling, right? Our emotion that we have when we think of the Middle Ages, right? The great northern French or English cathedrals, the Gothic, in fact, and not just in this architectonic point of view, but also like the great systematization of knowledge that we were discussing before, etc. But I would say that it's important because it objectively makes sense to think that there was a sort of core of let's say, of system of values, right? This idea is being enormously criticized, and I partly agree with it because it's objectively true that this was the expression of only certain classes, right? And especially of the church in many ways, because even if the ruling classes were at this point both lay and ecclesiastical, um, objectively, the church maintained the monopolium of knowledge at this time. But not just metaphorically. Like they really developed a lot of categories, a lot of systems that were naturally drawing heavily from even previous times. Times of the empire, of both of the Christian and the pagan empire. So obviously all the knowledge that came straight from the classical civilization. And they obviously re-elaborated them, so all the process of, or all the originality that we were mentioning before. So, even when we talk about the lay elites, we realize that the awareness to this about these values was much lower, right? Even the same concept of, even the chivalric idea, right? That is evidently permeated with Christian values. At one point, that on Schwerpunkt we are making a series that I really didn't create a dedicated playlist for, but that is concerned about looking at both the pagan and the Christian origins of chivalry, what we call chivalry. The lay aristocracy was much more pragmatic, right? There is really a differential, there is really a gap, a distance between what were the preached values and reality. And this is particularly important in these times, not because people were necessarily more hypocritical than we are today, but simply because, as I was saying before, there was a functionality in that approach, right? There are many examples of this. I can tell you, since I study mostly military history, that this is, for example, particularly evident in the alleged, morals of war, right? The idea, especially I studied for some time now, the 13th century especially fascinates me a lot, even if I am currently specializing in the 14th. For example, how military commanders, so even kings and big figures, dealt in the, let's call it official historiography, with, for example, having used on the battlefield certain kind of sneaky or pretty debatable, morally debatable tactics, right? And you say, well, the first approach is saying, here this guy felt guilty because he had really concealed that shock unit in that valley, in that forest, and made it coming out during the battle, with attacking the enemy from the flank. So in a truly unchivalric way that instead obviously emphasized the idea of face-to-face combat, etc. But when you go to the first approach is saying, okay, well, these were basically hypocrites, right? Because they had to make the official history, and they tried to conceal that. Even if other sources instead mentioned that, sources were not so interested in making of showing off from that guy's perspective, they simply told it that it had been the case. But then when you go to study more thoroughly what those sources were, you realize that many of these sources were developed in contexts that objective didn't quite participate to what, for example, the great political decisional process was at the time. Like, what do we know about, for example, the effective lay perspective? And sometimes you go look at the story and you realize that if you're lucky enough to have, which is very rare, but in certain cases it's possible to have the perspective of, not of the Dominican friar that wrote from the monastery that was, let's say, founded by that king that had used the tactic in the battle, but maybe a king's knight, right? That had maybe even, maybe had his family participating to the battle. It was a great honor prestige. You realize that they, from that lay perspective, that is usually minority, as you understand, you don't find that big deal of concealment, right? You do realize that, yeah, these people were used, for example, to listen to these songs about the great heroes of the epics that were all, from, also in here, really deriving either from the ancient world or the medieval world, or the Christian, with certain Christian values, also pagan ones, as you understand. It was really acceptable in certain ways, and therefore you realize that the voices of those who really participated to the battle and that had suffered the defeat and had the or had won it, probably had a completely different system of values. They really didn't care about the fact that attacking from the flank was a negative thing, right? They probably obviously said, well, damn, that was clever and maybe unexpected, and that's not loyal. They surely thought about that, but that was that there was a moral that had ever corresponded to that ideal is completely implausible, in my opinion. Or at least, even if we lack the evidence, there is no reason to suggest it, because in fact, we don't know, but also it's likely that different worlds had different environments, had different mindsets, right? So this idea of a system of value that we adopted historically just as an optical distortion of the historiographical bias of certain classes or certain political sides is definitely valid, and should always be borne in mind into this. But that's where things get, however, also, more interesting, and in parts also more complicated to assess. Because in the 14th and the 15th century, as we were saying before, there is the articulation around that very same system of core values, let's say of traditional values, that that was increasingly gravitating around mankind, and where a new conception of history was affirmed. This is particularly important because history up to that point had basically been told almost exclusively in a corrected form, right? With a name. History was not like the history we think today. Okay, let's try to wonder let's try to see what happened at that point, and let's try to be objective about it, and let's investigate in a way that can provide us with this degree of wanted objectivity. At the time, it was normal to use history as a, say, political tool. And when we judge, and it's really this is an important step to understand, when we criticize the past in this sense by saying, but this source is false, right? So it sucks. This guy was bad. It was evil. Was a liar. We really show anything, if anything, cultural backwardness, in my opinion, because we don't understand that you can't read the history that was written at the time, trying to, be pleased by it from a 21st century perspective. It doesn't make sense. The most beautiful thing, arguably, about these stories, these chronicles, these histories, is that they were writing, obviously, for an agenda at the time, that, however, is meaningful exactly because it's that agenda, right? It's like those people who believe, I don't know, that, for example, take political propaganda in the Middle Ages. Political propaganda in the Middle Ages was it was pretty damn refined, right? It was extremely sophisticated, and it used a specific lexicon because at the time there were all juridical reasons for this. It was all based to try to produce a vision as a distortion that, however, wasn't ideological. It was ideological, but it wasn't just ideological. I mean, it didn't just stop to the fact that you hated one guy's guts and therefore you could write rubbish about him and publish it. Publishing it. I mean, spreading it in some way. It didn't work like that. Aside from the fact that great part of even things like political propaganda were also orally transmitted, and that was a very important part of the story, absolutely not in a different way from the ancient world, for example. That political propaganda is a work of art and has to be contextualized in the culture of the time. Like when you read the typical insult that actually is typical of the Middle Ages, we find in different ways also in the ancient world. Things like that guy was a heretic or was a sodomite, right? These are, for example, words you find everywhere. But you don't have to believe that that's a literal thing. I mean, it's obvious that the first thing you would write in a civilization like the medieval one that was based in many ways from a cultural point of view on religion and on biblical references, that you would call a person a heretic and a sodomite, or sodomite, I don't know, you said it, because that was the regular thing you would do, and there is a striking homogeneity in this sense, even in the terms used, etc. And then you find 21st century, say, people without any pejorative qualification that actually interpret those writings literally, and even proving like this has been written some time in history, so it's a proof that this is the truth. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. If you don't contextualize a source, you can't basically understand it. I mean, it's that problematic because everybody's able of quoting. Not necessarily everybody, is able to understand that quote, and that's why it's dramatically easy, by the way, to tell history in a tendentious way. And they were masters in doing this, of course, but those were doing it for good, meaning that it was at the time the best thing to do. I mean, it's not a moral corruption, right? You can't say, well, but that maybe was a lie. You say, yeah, but it depends. I mean, what the ends were about. Right? You can't judge the mean if you don't consider the ends. Right? So this is another example, yet another example of how many people really pose themselves these problems today. Like, for example, try to contextualize a source in its historical environment, let's say. Very few. To many, it's sufficient to say, okay, well, that's what was written. I don't care there is 1,000 years of distance from this stuff. For me, I'll take it and I'll tell it the way I want. Right? We don't do this by definition. And that's really also what creates the greatest amount of problems, because naturally we can't reconstruct fully what the context was at the time. So there is always this ambiguity for which we have to surrender to our own ignorance about these worlds and just trying to guess more or less accurately what this could have been like at the time. But this shift towards mankind is particularly important, and as you understand it, it corresponds to humanism and all this stuff that precedes the Renaissance, as we name it. Also, this is not really something that started in the 14th century. The Middle Ages are much more complex. Humanism was present since ever civilization. I mean, ever since civilization exists, right? You can find humanism, in the Greek or Roman literature. You can find it obviously in the Bible. You can find it in this periods that in fact we call as the for example the 12th century Renaissance. This period in which even apparently through art we see it mostly, the conception of and literature as well, telling the truth, that of the vengeful God of the Old Testament progressively takes another form. This much more benign, benevolent figure, let's say, of the New Testament, the great promise, the great the human face, in fact, of Christ. This if you want, really, this optimistic take on existence more than on the future, because also in here the future was considered largely a moment of orbis senescet. This is the concept, that the idea is that the world was corrupting itself. This was an ancient vision that is not just presenting to Christianity, but also that had been embraced. The idea is that the world goes progressively towards the come of Satan, that precedes eventually the defeat at the hand of Christ, and so on. So the things are theoretically going to go always worse, which is also, by the way, something that we always say, historically speaking, also for reasons that would be interesting to explain. Maybe, well, sometimes you already did it, tried to do it at least. But in here, in the high and low, especially Middle Ages, something starts to change. It starts to change. Now we will try to explain why, but it kind of has to do with the way in which history was recorded. That's a very interesting reflection. And never think that history in this sense is just a boring thing to learn that nobody should care about because it's just, written paper. And it's not about real stuff. It's all about something that only happened in the past. People with historical culture have generally a deeper understanding of politics, of society as a whole, and learning about history does really make a difference in the way we in the construction, in building up really a civic intelligence in many ways, and to make us better people. So it's a very, very important asset we should invest on, because at least in educational terms, because that's really the sap of a healthy society in many ways. And the Renaissance does start in part from that. I mean, it's not just about a material thing. Obviously, the material thing helped because all this great amount of sources is present, because evidently there were more people who could live outside of mechanical works, like material works, that could be paid to study, right? So to do something that already at the time evidently was considered very, very precious, and a real investment, right? Where you think that medieval, like the humanists started existing for, was someone paying for them, and it wasn't just a leisure or a pleasure in this sense, or just a form of it was partly, yes, also kind of a form of munificence, etc., but there was a specific aim in that, and it was in fact in part aggrandizing the and changing people's mind. I mean, it was an idealistic turn, the idea of celebrating a certain dynasty, a certain power, interpreting history in a certain way, I must say that medievals were actually pretty respectful of more ancient history. Like, they weren't big twisters of the historical past. They were actually pretty interested into it, and what happens with humanism is that they start instead trying to understand it better, more accurately. So trying to find more things, to figure more things out, finding new texts, crossing them together, and this is something that starts way before what we call the Renaissance. So also never think that the Renaissance, when they broke out without prodromes, right? European uh, civilization was set on those tracks from literally from several centuries at that point. You can't trace back the roots of Renaissance since ever, basically. I like to think, it was already from the 11th century was a pretty. The same trend that eventually generates the Renaissance was there, factually. But this is just my opinion. But as you know, I care very much because about this perspective, because aside from destroying the technologistic prejudices of people learning through books written by others, like how to be a modern civilization, I also care about the fact that histories were a literary genre that was out there since ever, right? Europeans, just like any other civilization of some development at the time, did write histories. They did care about tracing a line of the past, and that could connect them with the past and understanding that. The love for the ancient, for example, it's not something that is born with the Renaissance. Like, the love for the ancient is literally present in every single moment of the Middle Ages. Obviously, there are areas that are more classically oriented, for obvious reasons, but even those areas of Europe that didn't know written culture up to the 12th, the 13th century, those were also equally, handing down the memory of their historical past, the historical slash mythological past. But it's obvious that also ancient historiography had set the trends for pretty damn good historiography, as you understand. So it's not surprising that at the end of the day, the medievals followed those tracks in the process. What was I saying? Oh yeah, well, that there are naturally, let's say, ancient authors that were incredibly modern. Like, if you read Polybius, for example, well, you say it seems like as if you were reading for someone that wrote those histories today, right? There is the concept of modernity is inherent there, something that is born in ancient Greece far back in the day, and that really informed Western civilization in a way that we must recognize, right? So the how does history change? Historiography change in the Middle Ages. Like, a history is thought at this point, towards the end of the Middle Ages, not much of a sort of divine picture and or manifestation in each of its aspects, right? Of divine will, let's say, but rather as the effect of the will and of human actions. Now, this is really important. You may think, well, this is modern thinking. This started in the Middle Ages, so it is true, eventually how things expand was recovering in part this, if it's not that even if you read ancient sources, they're always saying, it was God that, the gods that caused this. Also in there, there is a process of this kind, like, more archaic sources tend to obviously credit more important. To look at, uh, also things like Hellenic historiography weren't born out of nothing. They came from a world that was pretty, still similar in some ways to this kind of religiously dominated universe, and that from which eventually some sort of reason detaches itself, right? And tries, by the way, however, to investigate the world on the base of such understanding. Like, is it Athens or Jerusalem? Sometimes it's really both, right? The concept is, you need and these systems to give an answer. In most cases, if you take scholastics, that's what it had been. It was really combining Christian religion with Aristotle, and making sense of a world that at the time, if you consider you don't know physics, you don't know what science in terms of modern science has been, that we know obviously what it has been now, but at the time they were doing a pretty damn good job, right? It's kind of embarrassing when you hear people, well, this stuff was wrong. They didn't know what the world was like, they invented it. Well, but do you think it was easy to formulate concepts like those with the base of knowledge that existed at the time? And it's, I don't want to make now as certain examples, but that's important. But anyhow, this new element of will, of human actions, is particularly important. You arrive at the end of the Middle Ages with Machiavelli, that is, in this sense, a modern thinker that says, what, there is God that naturally dictates, that orders the world, that has its own design, but there is still a part of our own space that we can carve in this sense, trying to make to fight against fortune. Also, these are already kind of classical, if you want, and almost pagan-like. There is a great deal of pagan revival in the Renaissance, as you know, but it still manifests the idea that there was a coexistent system, right? Machiavelli was not an atheist. He simply said, basically, that sometimes you have to go against religion in order to achieve good, depends for whom, because actually at that point it's about a specific country, for example, a specific state. So this starts getting pretty interesting, but this way of thinking emerges in the ability of looking at history much before the 16th century. So naturally, this change in looking at the world brought with itself a new way of conceiving the present and past reality, right? If the cause of historical becoming resided in the action of mankind, and of single men, actually, individuals, as a consequence, there was not a real traceability of, in the real world, of the signs of a relation with the supernatural, right? So, in order to explain events, you didn't have to look at them within a the frame of a symbolic meaning that could pose them in relation with or with the divine, like the visible with the invisible, right? This is a great shift, and it happens gradually, and the two things coexist at the same time. And the other big change is that historical events could not be decontextualized and simply, for example, to other and put in relation with others for analogy. Also, when they were far in space and time, reality started to be read according to a precise historical conscience, and in this sense, the facts started to be observed in order to research within them the possible moral teachings that, however, at this point were relative to practice rather to certain transcendental meanings. As you understand, this is pretty revolutionary, if you want. I hate the term revolutionary, but for a world that apparently, at least, had been focused on just trying to decipher the great symbol of the creation within a divine symbolism and understanding, the idea of putting that aside and of relying instead on something more practical, that was devoid of this specific narrative, celestial narrative, let's say, is quite a big change. And you may wonder, but how, wasn't this challenged in some sense? I mean, weren't, for example, ecclesiastical authorities adverse to it? Well, really, no. And this is also another very interesting side of the story. Leaving aside that the church was at this point one of the greatest mecenates, and therefore it financed, Rome is the great capital of the Renaissance, let's say, at least in the 16th century. In the 15th, it's Florence, but the concept is that the same church was pretty damn interested in getting these new perspectives. The church had always been capable of picking the very best of intellectual resources and to fundamentally expand into knowledge as much as they could to back their own prerogatives. And this had been done in the most diverse ways, as you know. Think just about the donation of Constantine that happened lots of centuries before. But you may say, well, this sounds ridiculous. It talks about dragons. It's even historically inaccurate in terms of even of things like dates, etc. Well, yes, but do you realize for the time what it meant to build such an elaborated construction, and especially to use it in order to back certain prerogatives? It was the same Roman Catholic humanist that actually debunked Constantine's donation, Constantine's donation document, and you would be surprised, by the way, how many other similar stuff actually existed out there previously. And the reason is naturally that also the surprise that these humanists had in finding these things out is that they didn't have this perception of context. They simply were trying to look now what really mattered, what was really kind of accurate, and what could be, let's say, interpreted on the basis of other more correct sources, especially the ancient ones. And therefore, even in here, the wars instead of humanism and of the Renaissance emerged, because it's in here that the contempt towards medieval times emerges, and that's the same way of which the term Middle Ages was created, right, for actually depreciating this Middle Age, such considered because it was theoretically this pretty stagnating hole between the great classical civilization and this future that appeared somewhat positive. But telling the truth, it wasn't positive at all, because actually the 16th and the 17th century were actually dramatic moments. Like there was also in here the European civilization progressing, going on its way, but it was a moment of great disorientation. Just think about what the Reformation did. Like many people assume that the discovery of the Americas was somehow the big thing of the time. Absolutely not. The biggest thing of the time was really the fracture, the schism within Western Christianity. It was a pretty messed up thing for those people's ideas and thinking. So you can realize even in here how much more varied and gradual, and in some ways also naive, the switch from the what we would call today fairy tale, in sense of things that were invented historiographically speaking, and let's say modern philology actually is. The reason why the let's say that there was no opposition to such change is that objectively people were interested to know, and as long as really the doctrine, Christian doctrine was not challenged, and there was basically no reason to do it at the time, because why what would have been the reason to do it at the time objectively? There was no one. It was not a repressed thing. Obviously heresy was repressed where it occurred, but never forget the fact that religion was a largely functional, especially how it was really lived at the time, tool for a functional society, right? Obviously, this changes throughout all history. You can't take a Christian of the early 2000s and comparing it to one of the early 1000, right? Or even of the 500 AD. There are different ways in which religion is perceived, is lived, is felt, is sometimes even it is interpreted at the end of the day, because there is not a person who has ever interpreted one text in a single way, even if sometimes you read certain stuff in these medieval sources, you say, but these were people, for example, that believed in astrology, among the other things. You may say, well, but astrology was something ancient, pagan. Yeah, it was, but these were Christians and believed in that as well. And it's interesting because in the same sources it says something, it's God's will, because there were things like this, even when there were earthquakes or other catastrophes and other stuff, everybody wanted to know why, for example. And at the time, to try to find a concrete reason. So basically, I was just reading this source of the 14th century. It made me reflect, because this happened in Florence, and it was like I don't remember what. It was like a storm, something extremely violent. A lot of people died, something like that. And the first thing the commune does is to the commune, that is the government, basically, to question certain astrologers, and which are evidently paid. They have to relate their, and basically the astrologers speak, and they say something like this, that they give their explanation about all the planets' alignments and all this stuff that could explain the natural catastrophe. But they say, first of all, that it was always God's will, and therefore and it's interesting because in the letter, in this chronicle, it's not really written that they are saying, it's God that made this happen in with this planet. It simply says it was God's will. But however, for what we are concerned about knowing the stars, so it's as if that had been somehow detached from divine will, which is paradoxical. So these guys were simply saying, it's all about God. End of the story. But we think that, however, certain things happen because this stuff has changed, right? So, and they couldn't go beyond. I mean, they wouldn't go beyond that, because otherwise they would have gotten into a pretty dangerous track, because at that point, well, they could have sensibly drawn, obviously, maybe was somehow implied, the connection between God's will and the disposition of planets. But also in here, the thing is much more complicated than this. We consider that medievals still believed that nature was somehow permeated with strange phenomena, like certain manifestations, like ghosts, spirits, other devils. It was a world that hadn't quite still even rationalized even the idea of religion. As you know, Christianity was, like all monotheisms, was pretty dismissive of other beliefs, right? But the middle age, like of especially polytheism or all these other spiritual entities in some ways that could manifest themselves in the world. So also here there are huge chapters we could open on alchemy and all this stuff, but it's very eloquent that medieval civilization still believed that basically two things existed, and you couldn't ask them how, because they didn't care at the end of the day. They didn't even want to know how the two things were related. As long as Nicene Creed was accepted, everything was fine. Then they could learn about other stuff and pretending that things happen for this kind of reasons, but without ever conflicting with religion. So actually, all the times you find even heretics burned at the stake, it wasn't much because they were spies that told, that guy's he's an heretic, or that is witch, that woman is a witch. There were big motives, like individuals preaching things that were considered at that point kind of unorthodox. But when they started having a following, when these things, as it often happened, were taking kind of political meanings more than religious ones. Witch hunting is renowningly not a medieval Catholic phenomenon, but a modern Protestant one, by massive large. There are certain things that change over time and take different directions, also depending on the countries, depending on the cultures. And actually the church guided throughout all this, at least the Middle Ages, but partly also beyond, catalyzed even the scientific discovery. Like Galileo's was actually commissioned by the Pope to undertake the research that eventually would put himself in trouble. There was a much greater flexibility that that is really unknown to anyone who has ever bothered him or herself to study these things. It obviously wasn't a monolithic situation where there was obscurantism, oppression from every corner. Actually, the church was pretty damn effective in actually educating, like teaching people how to write, how to read. And this is obvious. Even the Inquisition, that is so low that it passes like the worst thing that ever happened. Basically, it's one of those stupid cliches people think about the Middle Ages. The Inquisition, first of all, killed very few people, compared to what normal justice was about in all the lay countries. It was one of the very few guaranteed tribunals that existed out there, which meant that you couldn't condemn someone without it wasn't proved that he was guilty, which didn't happen elsewhere, at least in majority of other places. Inquisition was liked by people. Like, people liked Inquisition. They wanted it. They felt it was a kind of guarantee on the social contract, the cohesion. They were kind of happy about it, and it did promote education. People were pushed by the church to learn and read. The greater pusher since the early Middle Ages, by the way, I even made a video about that. That the greatest entity that pushed people to learn, and it was also relatively, especially in the early Middle Ages, but also later on, absolutely not fussy about social extraction, was the church. Like, if you could, which was rare at the time, to go to get an education rather than being a peasant, you could go there. There was always someone who could teach you within the church, and actually even the lay culture that is what emerges here from the 14th century, 15th century, something that originally evolved within the ecclesiastical institutions. Like, the cathedral schools were the place where also laymen went to learn Latin, to study things, where the first jurists began to study, and were also the first lay centers, universities and stuff emerged. So naturally, I'm not saying that here they were champions of free thinking, of freedom, of rights. This is what we're concerned about today. At the time, however, it was a pretty damn big option that it was offered to you, and society kind of worked decently about it. I've been reading now a lot of chronicles, especially from the low Middle Ages, and this oppressive picture doesn't at all emerge from it. And I've read, and this is what I will try to insist now because it's important, lay historiography, not ecclesiastical historiography. Also in here, even in certain languages like English, for example, you have the word clerk that is referred to basically bureaucrats, administrators, something like that, and it even that still bears the name, in fact, of the clergy, because at the time, it is a term that comes from the Middle Ages. In fact, the literate people were normally just the ecclesiastics, but it starts not being so, especially in certain regions of Europe, like where in fact lay production emerges. This is probably very controversial to make clear, to clarify, because in fact this is probably one of the greatest stereotypes of the Middle Ages, trying to make you understand that not all writers were ecclesiastics. There wasn't anything like a mega conspiracy about keeping the facade clean to pretend that it was the pious, harmonious Christian society. Have you ever read medieval chronicle? But even of some, do you think that's a cool picture that emerges? Do you think that there is an agenda in there? I believe people will say, an agenda like trying to fake, for example, history in this sense. Sometimes it happens. I found it also, but they were still framed into an interpretation at the time of history that was still based on a sort of general consensus. Like, it wasn't just a bunch of clergymen writing their history from their monasteries and pretending that was the reality of being. Because people remembered, there were ways, people knew things, they transmitted them. From the 13th century, 14th century, you start finding now a pretty damn deep and articulated and pretty critical understanding of history. Now, if you take certain countries where even humanism and the Renaissance arrived like much later, sometimes even of centuries, right? Here it has to do also with the periodization of the Middle Ages. There are countries where the Renaissance arrived objectively later, especially in Northern Europe, from where other areas of Europe had begun from. So it's not all places are alike. And if you read, for example, those Italian chronicles from the 14th century, you compare them even to maybe, let's say, Flemish chronicles, they seem like 1 century ahead in terms of historiographical development, intelligence, criticism. They're so widened. and they do that on a mentality that is largely lay, and that probably has to do a lot with it, and that corresponds, in fact, to an understanding of the world that is increasingly detached from the symbolism, but and here where things gets really interesting, that probably had always been like that, like in some measure, meaning if layman starts to write, sometimes it's embarrassing how it happens, even historiographically speaking, that there is a certain specific moment from which you start finding certain sources, um, written even in vernacular language. Sometimes it's a matter of generation, and you understand at that point. It's not that people invented vernacular at that point. It was already spoken. It was already an understanding of the world that was expressed in that specific fashion. Naturally, didn't correspond to the religious framing and interpretations of the world. It was based on much more practical experience and knowledge and understanding, and that they were written, by the way, for other laymen. That is also very important. So never stereotype the whole Middle Ages to the peculiarities of certain countries that had certain historical developments, certain particular orientations. The Middle Ages starts and to produce this thinking, and it evolves, in fact, into humanism, into what we call at least humanism, and the Renaissance pretty quickly. That's why the humanism starts in Italy in the 14th century, or in the Renaissance in the 15th, and then it spreads basically all over. There were other centers, like many people think that, I don't know, for example, also in Germany there is a Renaissance. There is this, and it is importantly tied to this lay perspective. All right, that starts emerging pretty alive, pretty strong, pretty complete. Right, didn't have much to learn. There were not a bunch of people who were peasants up to the year before. These were, for example, commoners classes, mercantile classes since centuries. They had already developed their own culture, their own vision of the world, their ability of explaining. Simply Latin had remained, even the problem. Let's say the linguistical problems are also even more complex now. We can't descend into them, but even the same concept of why they start to write about their own cities, for example, and how history goes. So this goes along actually with another big prejudice, that is about the reliability of sources. As we were saying before, you can't take a medieval source and pretending that that's reality most of the times, even when it's pretty damn plausible and well researched, evidently. The reason why you can't take that, it's not much of an ideological reason, but that happens, that it does exist. But also and especially for the the real need that existed beyond that. Like, how would you, for example, in a world there's no scientific categorization, for example, how do you tell history? That is important to understand. I mean, even the concept of approximation and precision of accuracy are very different. One period from another. They're not like we look at history. Like, and this is, I mean, sometimes it's frustrating because you read a source and you say, well, but this guy doesn't get to the point I need. But it's within the limits of that same source that in many ways you can understand that what was beyond that. I mean, maybe if not understanding, but completely, of course, but trying to accept it, to frame it into something larger, to a broader mindset. That's also why reading different chronicles is so important, and why it's also important to read chronicles of different historical backgrounds or social backgrounds, and because they produce different histories. in this sense, ecclesiastical historiography lags behind. Like if you read a 14th century source written by a commoner in, I have always the example like of the chronicles, chiefly of Italy and of other areas, kind of connected. But for example, let's say in that specific case, the the ecclesiastical sources more or less write the same things. They had always written, like, even in terms of style, in terms of even of chronological setting, the lay ones rocket to the stars. They are pretty damn accurate. They're much better, and they are born sometimes. Like, also in here, the moment of birth is relative, but because even the early chronicles sometimes were pretty similar to the ecclesiastical annals, right? They followed a pretty logical order. It was mostly chronological, saying, I don't know, 1289. We had this happen, point 1220, 1290, sorry, and it goes on, like relatively small things. Then it starts getting more complex. Right? You see it even in the same sources that are particularly developed, that they wanted, for example, to make a history, a universal history, for example, starting literally from from Adam and Eve, and mostly, obviously the beginnings are very, concise, and then getting to the history of their own city. Interestingly enough, and you can say that, I don't know, if there is a 14th century chronicle, maybe the story starts from the 12th century to be based on actual city chronicles that had existed and that have very scanty information that obviously these people didn't know much about otherwise, because also the historical memory was much short in back in time. It's not that people knew much about their grandparents or their great-grandparents. Basically, they had a pretty short memory in time. They had a pretty damned memory, actually, but good memory, but it was kind of pragmatically oriented more than else. But you start finding that, in fact, the information increases progressively throughout all the later years, and that at that point they know a lot, also because most of the times they were basically protagonists or of the same of the very same episodes that were undergoing too. And this is interesting because when we talk about the contraction of the mid 14th century, what happens is that Europe gets in many ways sort of refeudalized, and as a consequence, even in humanism, and never to forget this, information really people were writing much more with an agenda than before, and therefore sometimes they were brought away from the let's say from the public offices, etc., by the lords, for example, and they were starting to write on behalf of the lord without knowing anymore what the main political things really were, because they weren't anymore in first like protagonists of that very thing. Aside from this, the concept is that there is much more to know than this few information I gave you gives you hopefully a much broader perspective of what a medieval source can be. And believe me, there are things, if you want I can make some videos about this stuff, because there are certain things that surprise you, right? Even for example, I'm always hunting for military details, right? And it's something that you probably only military historians can get the degree of frustration to read sources and sources and sources that objectively talk 80% about war, that however do not explain you exactly what went on, right? What kind of information, like how, for example, battles worked in terms of formations and so on. Sometimes that's, for example, by reading a lot of them, that you start sensing how, even plastically, like how these things could be, in spite of the lack of information, because they render you a picture that at that point it starts getting very detailed about other stuff that can make you reflect on how things that are not said explicitly could be, or maybe hints. There's also a problem finding one statement in one source that maybe is pretty enlightening, but that doesn't quite count for all the other sources, because reason by analogy is important. We should all be able to do it, but it's also pretty risky, pretty dangerous, very often. But obviously religious sensibility always remains. These sources are not telling you that there was a hidden side of the story that basically pops out in when non-clergy starts to write. This shows a world that was naturally pretty religious. But it was in a functional way, because largely people were pragmatically oriented at the time. So even religion was meant in this way. So that's when the more elaborated the source is in terms of political and social elevation, let's say. So the more you should be suspicious about what its motives are. If you start reading a diary instead, a family diary, well, you can be more, more trusting. And it's obvious that in those historiographies, like the French or the English one, where there were strong monarchies that, or at least, strong for compared to whatever existed at the time, were producing sources magnifying the crown, or at least telling the story of the crown. Obviously, you can't say, well, in there that they probably had much more of an agenda than others, because they were paid to write stuff like that. But don't dismiss them. Don't think that something simply because it comes from a source, from a chronicle, from a literary source, is not reliable. It's silly. You can't reason like that. People say, well, there are archives, there are more precise documents. Yes, but archives are limited in size. I mean, we are planning, like, Europe has still a huge amount of medieval sources that are all still to be studied. Surely from the time of humanism, maybe even before, where lots of people kind of reading through them, but we still lack a lot of study on specific sources. And history, at the end of the day, is an infinite, let's say, ensemble, a container of information, because the way you combine them does make a huge difference, right? And there are also many problems of method that are involved in the process, but maybe now we are a bit too far from deepening that. But you understand that in general, in this perspective, the historical becoming is, in the Middle Ages, starts to be conceived as the succession of epochs that are distinct to one from the other, right? And there is, in parallel, obviously, the affirmation, gradually, of course, of the idea of a sort of sharp split, let's say, between the present and the immediately preceding epoch, as much as the latter and even a more distant one. So the men of the 14th and 15th century felt themselves to be in some measure different under the moral and cultural profile from those who had lived in the even the most recent past. I don't know how really whether this is really true, because this is a perspective that comes into my mind now as a consequence of what we're talking, we're discussing. But and I mean, it is true because the mere idea of writing history is new to certain classes, to certain perspectives, and the past is now being studied as something that happened that you want to recount, not that you need to let's say, to frame into a broader perspective that can serve maybe to your maybe can maybe serve to the king, to the church, and it is functional like that, but that now has different aims because it's kind of freer, right? It's functional to other objectives, to other aims. But the thing that starts happening here, quite sadly, is that the most recent past was also starting to be conceived in a kind of a negative way. This is the bad branch of the Renaissance. That is not all of the Renaissance, but that surely contributed to, as a deep prejudice, to represent the Middle Ages in the negative light that is usually represented since those times, actually, in the West. Because this most recent past now starts being conceived as something you have to surpass. Why? Because, well, this surpassing can bring to the reconjunction, an ideal reconjunction at least, with a more distant age, preferably the ancient one, where it was possible to find the genuine roots of the new values that were being elaborated at the time. This is also important, trying to explain the prejudices that we have, not just towards the Middle Ages, but towards the ancient world. Like the myth of the ancient world as the golden age of humanity. I mean, maybe it's excessive even for humanistic standards, but let's say this idea that civilization existed, then the Middle Ages comes, right, and everything starts back in the Renaissance, is something that is being built conceptually in the Renaissance, right? And as you know, also in other videos, I also in this one, it's pretty evident that I distrust deeply, that I absolutely don't believe this is true, historically speaking. That, I mean, the Middle Ages were kind of an inferior time in history, but many people still do. So sometimes I pose myself the problem of asking myself, but is there something you want to give maybe to those who think differently from you in this, under this specific topic? Well, as you know, I hope not to be a moral relativist, so I must give something that, first of all, yes, it is true. The Middle Ages were, if you take some standards that are difficult to set, though, were a moment of relative, at least for for a certain time, like half of the Middle Ages, were fundamentally a more um, I mean, let's say better, a less developed society than what the ancient world had been. This is a very controversial statement already by itself, because it doesn't quite mean much. We don't really know much about uh, like the measures. Sometimes I looked at some graphs written probably by designed by, I don't know, um, a Renaissance apologist maybe, given this specific prejudice against the Middle Ages, which showed something like it was a graph showing in like with x and epsilon axis, um, the the degree of social complexity from the ancient world to the medieval world. And the picture was basically, that from the ancient world was an enormous social complexity that eventually falls brutally and radically to the ground during the early Middle Ages, and that it takes like arriving up to the 19th century to reach the degree of human complexity, of social complexity, than the Roman Empire. And that's completely insane. I I've been studying Middle Ages for some year now, and I'm far from trusting myself when making this kind of pontifical statements. But I believe that Europe was a more socially complex system than the ancient world, um, since the 13th century, at least. And here I'm not really talking about, I mean, social complexity also in here is a pretty tricky term, but I'm talking really about of potential, right? What was really the ability of pretty material sometimes. You know, how many people there were, what was their per capita wealth, and the general ability of moving around in a functional way. Like the Middle Ages by the 13th century definitely reach and surpass the ancient world, and there is nothing that will make me think otherwise, because sometimes it is true. For example, quality of life was not necessarily the same thing. It seems that there's been some scholars that have said that the quality of life of Antony in Rome are reached once again by 14th century Florence. Now the problem with this is that because like we have sources with about 14th century Florence that tell us literally everything that was there, like how many people went to school, how much they ate, like from 14th century sources. Very beautiful to read, by the way. Now the problem is, how can you actually measure Antonine Roman quality of life exactly? Even if we had similar data to compare, how can you be you know satisfied with any comparison, given the amount uh, of unknowns that is out there, right? It's I don't really buy it, right? I don't think that necessarily the ancient world was this great pool of wealth, well-being that sometimes it's depicted, nor the Middle Ages were. Absolutely, I'm not here. I would like to leave you with the sense that the problem is setting the grounds to make a comparison that is something debatable, more than, because we are obsessed by the data. Data, we know how much people ate, like for one source, like, yeah, but you have to contextualize that source. How can you I mean, heuristically speaking, what's the point? Why should you even compare these realities that are so different from each other, but that we know about so very few? Whatever. This was just one of my endless digressions. Um, but it's nevertheless important that there is the progressive dimensioning in the 14th, 15th century of historical times. That is largely what we maintained to this point, because really, these were 14th and 15th century authors. So now we have, for example, we consider them as kind of moderns. I mean, maybe not these ones, maybe they're mostly humanists, medieval humanists. At least humanists have received the punishment of falling in their own trap, like fitting into the Middle Ages that they so despise more than the ancient world, but also, excuse me, than the modern world. But also in here, however, there is the good side of humanism and of the Renaissance that are able to look at history in a healthy way. And in my opinion, part of the fault is really our own, in how we interpreted the humanists. Because that's the other problem in turn. Like, the humanists were writing this concept now in a way that we assume was kind of free. That wasn't free either. Definitely they were a bit in love with themselves, about their new ideals, the idea that there was a terrible Middle Ages that had to be surpassed. But even if you read the humanists, you realize that it's very progressive. I mean, there wasn't this explicit, direct, omnipresent contempt towards the Middle Ages because they thought to be something else. They still try to make sense of what they are, at which point they are fundamentally, and sometimes even unconsciously, like more they show that they are aware more than else about the new capabilities that they acquired, rather than dismissing the past. Like, and sometimes with the humanist, what's the prototype of humanist that you have? There were so many different ones, so many different craftsmen and artists and scientists, philologists. So it depends. Probably the most radical contempt toward the ancient world was from classicists and philologists, like those who really tried to imitate Latin because they thought, they had found the true spring of Cicero and Virgil, and they looked at medieval Latin and said, look at these guys, they couldn't even read, they couldn't even write in proper Latin. And this is unfortunately a prejudice that it still exists. Like, at university, I must say that, now many of you will hate me for this, but I think I'm happy to be specifically a historian, because when I met philologists or other people studying literature, there was a sort of or linguists, there was a sort of fanaticism about the formal side of the story, like how the difference between a philologist and a historian is that the philologist fundamentally looks at the text and its combinations, and how you can date that, and what kind of historical accuracy there is, where did those versions come from, how was the text composed. So that requires an enormous skill and a great technical awareness. But sometimes there is, like, even with language teachers, there is more than just the letter, right? There is more than just how it sounds or what this could be like, but there should be a broader context in which to frame it. Otherwise, you talk about a world that you presume to understand on the base of refined research that, however, you can take beyond what really the boundaries of that life was. So historians sometimes are a bit clumsy, and they are more in love with the big explanations, the big systems, and we objectively can make a big deal of misuse of this, a lot of mistakes as well. But at least I believe we try to look a bit more widely to the perspective. I think that many Renaissance say scholars that were dissatisfied with with medieval times were doing it out of the frustration of seeing that there had been a proper Latin, classical Latin, that during medieval times had obviously been lost. But what's the point of making a like I don't know how to say that, like a comparison in general between these elements. Like, it's obvious that in the Middle Ages there would be some changes in that regard, that people wouldn't care to study rhetorical. They would simply write in that way because that was easy to do, and it's more about what they wanted to tell you should be focused on, not on how, in which language they wrote it. And by the way, medieval Latin is beautiful also in its mistakes, and it's because you can't really understand that world through them. And that's what history is really about. Not making comparisons between ages, like saying, this sucked because, the it doesn't correspond to my standards of civilization. Well, it doesn't make a great sense. There is, it's pretty arrogant to do in the first place, and anti-historical also in many ways, because it's not about history, it's not about the research, but about judging. And a person would judge us rather than, like I do, by the way, a lot, evidently, rather than researching more thoroughly is, it's more about the BS at that point than the alleged objectivity that we all research when we make history, right? But, so, at the end of the day, it was thus being born the concept of Middle Ages. That is, the idea of a period that was in between classical antiquity and what was the present time of the time, that came, I would say, immediately to be considered under a negative light, like an age of regression in the frame of the human history, basically, in the human existence, the human civilization. This was there would be a lot to add to this, because just think about the differences in political fragment. The idea of political fragmentation. Think about what was, for example, the potential of Europe during, in fact, the 14th and 15th century, in terms of it's true, at this point there are professional armies that are starting to develop, but let's take an earlier time, like in the 11th century. Like, even if there was no real political unity, the empire was what it was, and so on, but just think of objectively at how many people could Europe move at the time. You'd say, well, but they were all scattered. Yeah, well, but they were more than before. I mean, here it's complicated sometimes to explain, because it's all political and social at the base. It's not really that resources were less than the ancient world. I mean, it was the Carolingians that managed to colonize Germany, not the Romans. There are, even in terms of rate of growth, in terms of trade activity, Middle Ages are the apex of kind of mercantilism in some ways. Well, of course, the modern age more, but surely more than the ancient world. There are, if you judge by certain Romans were not able to build cathedrals, Gothic cathedrals. Absolutely, they didn't have the technology for doing that, or at least they maybe would have had them if they, however, would have had the medieval context to develop. And don't tell me that things like the Pantheon or Hagia Sophia are something more complex to build than the Gothic cathedrals, because objectively they are not, from an engineeristic point of view, even though they remain amazing feats that, in part in this sense, the medievals couldn't achieve. but the medievals achieved much more also in a relatively few time when they finally had the resources and the know-how. So even from this technological point, take the great domes of great Florence or other areas. I mean, even in there was an imitation of the past, but even in here, you can't even say that the knowledge had been lost and that these people began to build certain stuff once again because they had started reading ancient manuals. Those people started to read ancient manuals, but they already had in mind how to achieve something like that, how to achieve such buildings, the construction of such buildings. Maybe I'm digressing too much, but I think it's important to remember, at least in pills, these concepts. The the product of this, let's say, this prejudice towards the Middle Ages were essentially the product of the reflection and of the mental / intellectual attitude of the Italian humanists, right? So also in here, talking about humanism and Renaissance, we're talking chiefly about Italian culture, and a culture that spread throughout all modern Europe. So that modern that thinking was kind of fashionable. Italy kept producing for centuries the most advanced scientific, engineeristic, architectonic, artistic, etc. treatises. It was the country that developed the most sophisticated lexicon. Everybody kind of absorbed that. So that's partly what the Renaissance was about, in this sense, having seen that there were different Renaissance everywhere, but Italian influence was overwhelming everywhere. And so this mental attitude went along with it. So who had been these humanists? Well, these were, we will maybe talk about them another time more specifically, but they were the intellectuals that between the 14th and 15th century had reapproached classical culture, or at least approached classical culture with a new aim. And the first one was essentially, especially for humanists proper, the research of the original expressions of classical culture, and to free them from the distortions had been carried out by the men of the Middle Age. As you understand, it's pretty, and also in here it's somewhat approximated, because these were still people of the Middle Ages. So it's not right, in my opinion. If you take what is considered the first humanist, that is Petrarch, he was a person who was very snobbish in this sense. He liked to write in a pretty good Latin in many ways. He even tried to readapt the script in a kind of a more classical fashion that to a Renaissance that was writing essentially a early medieval, but thought they were basically Roman script, actually coming from period of which Roman script had already transformed sensibly. But this, however, still wrote in vernacular. He still wrote in that medieval mindset, in that medieval perception that actually made him so famous. Because, as you know, Petrarch was being famous chiefly because of his the canzoniere. So he is this chants, these songs basically, that he wrote in vernacular Italian, and they're his greatest work. And he would have been, and Petrarch was a great romantic. He was the typical, but he expresses this. You can understand he loved the ancient world intellectually because he was seduced by it. But he was told even to be talking. He loved to be alone, to talk with Cicero, with all these figures. But in its deepest core, in his heart, he was still expressing the very best of his art and poetry in vernacular, and with a mindset that was influenced by chivalry, by all these medieval ethics in so many ways, but was also trying to recover something from the past. So even in him, especially, it's this love for the ancient is very evident. But if you look at it in perspective, it's still very, especially with later humanists, you understand that he was still a man of the Middle Ages, in spite of all. And probably I like to think that he would have still preferred to consider himself as such at the end of the day, because he knew what his roots were. And as I was saying at the beginning of the video, this is an amazing achievement of medieval civilization. It's not an achievement of the ancient civilization. Ancient civilization didn't exist anymore. It was these medieval people who took it back, thought, with the awareness that basically they would be able to transform their own world through it. So this is amazing, really, and it's such a deep thought that probably the other civilizations didn't pose their problem. Like in the ancient world, in some ways, was also very classicist in this sense. Was somewhat not arid, because it wasn't, but it kind of didn't pose itself the problem. It had other horizons. It had other thinking. It was partially content with its own models, right? These people were able to look more deeply, more characteristically at the process, right? Yeah, so I think this is important. So eventually, over this stratum of humanism, that, as you understand, begins fairly early in time, there were so many other thinkers, because basically humanists had been the base now for the new thought. They hadn't been just tangent currents. They were really they were at the apex of the even of the elites. I mean, in terms of intellectual elites, they were really the leading figures. So eventually, as you know, this is also a very wide topic, but a bit Renaissance Europe was based on these concepts, and upon them, also the Protestants started to reflect. For example, the Protestants, for example, intended to come back to the purity, in this case of Christianity, the Christianity of the origins. Think about how important for Luther it was St. Paul, for example, aside from Augustine, that obviously came later. But looking at what the true evangelic message was, and being inspired by this problem of the sources of the origin. This is important because it's really ad fontes, to the sources. Let's reread these sources. Let's not stop. And it's a kind of an obvious need, right? You can't, in my opinion, it's not fair. I think I've reconsidered the thing some time now, that you can't consider the humanists just those guys who were posh about the Middle Ages. You have to understand what the need really was, really to resystematize knowledge in a way that could be accessible, could be kind of exact, concrete, so that there could be, yes, an imitation of the past, but this need started still from a medieval civilization. It was the medieval civilization that posed itself the problem. So that's when, as I was saying before, you have to be already at the same level of what you're trying to imitate in order to make it function. And this functioned pretty damned well, because basically Europe went on with the Renaissance myth till we can say today, in certain measure, even if we don't quite see it like that, because we think mostly about the Enlightenment. But don't believe that what was started by the Renaissance is actually not about the same need for certainties in the understanding of the world. You can argue that every system at one point is about this, yes, but even historiography was based on this. I mean, the concept of that you need reliable sources and to make a philological research in order to understand them. Well, it is born here. You have to give to them. So I'm not really contrary to the idea that this was a positive step, that it brought, as it always does in civilization, to certain fanatic extremes. But they are extremes. I want to see the Renaissance in its beauty, in its intelligence, in its skill, like a product not of fanatism, but a product of crafting, of intelligence, of accomplishment, of endeavors that were tested on the ground, right? So that also had, by the way, this is very important to understand, that when you read treatise from the Renaissance, etc., you have to realize, as we were saying before, that they're just the tip of the iceberg. That those books could be written, those humanists could write and produce those texts because there was a material world that had allowed it, right? Like the need of writing, even the same print, it's not born because people recovered the knowledge of the ancient Romans and Greeks. It was born because people needed we needed a lot of books, needed to maintain, they needed to store information, they needed to learn, to remember, to write, to read, right? And this was born because of certain largely socio-economical reasons that have nothing to do with, in this sense, with the treatise in themselves, right? So never always consider what the base was. This is maybe it's always the eternal clash between the structure and the idea. But I suspect in this case the structure is really too wide just to think that the idea was leading the thing, right? And we know it simply because when we study history of science, history of technology in these cases, you realize that especially material know-how was already there, right? There wasn't really it was first about the manual and then the practice. No, it was first about the practice and then the manual. So this is a general general pattern for understanding certain processes. And then we're really probably the greatest contempt towards the Middle Ages didn't quite come from the Renaissance in itself, because after all, the Middle Ages were, now this is perhaps complex, but the real idea that the Middle Ages were really an obscurantist period, which is also another, is a slightly different concept, is an Enlightenment concept. Like, because the Renaissance thought that the Middle Ages were just a mediocre period, or a kind of deficient period in some ways. The Enlightenment added to it kind of an ideological malice to the equation. And it was mostly in a sort of anti-establishment sense, like against the monarchies, against the church. But that came later in with the context of the 18th century that was naturally different for other historical reasons, etc. So even in here, it took a lot of time before the Middle Ages were considered like a dark thing in absolute terms. But it was still, at the same time, the moment in which things started to change, and they started to change through historiography, through how people put themselves in relation with their past, which had been something that in the rest of the Middle Ages hadn't happened in a such a critical fashion like it would start from the 14th to 15th century. Um, it sadly, in this centuries, the there is maybe to say that even during the 14th and 15th century there were some anti-clerical more than anti-religious, absolutely, instances. Like the idea of the Middle Ages, like a moment of obscurantism and of progressive crisis of the evangelic message, went along with the conviction that the end of the Roman Empire had interrupted the development of certain values that only in the present had come to attention, which is kind of paradoxical in some ways, because also in here the relation with the empire, the Roman Empire, is quite of a challenging one, but this set was still within a Christian ideal, right? So even the Protestants didn't quite dislike, for example, the Middle Ages as such. It was just, they were just saying, oh well, it was all about the papacy, right? So it was negative because of that reason, but otherwise it would have been, there were still heroes in there that are kind of proto-Protestants. This is something that interestingly the Enlightenment did as well, by saying, like, thinking that, I don't know, certain, but not just for the Middle Ages, that certain people, for example, that were certain heretics were sort of heroes of free thinking that the church had killed, which is absolutely false, because most of the heretics that went at the stake during the Middle Ages were actually not free thinkers at all. They were religious fanatics, really, and the main reason why they died was that they were creating serious problems, not much just to the doctrine, to the church, that sometimes also painted them as kind of misbelievers on purpose, but really because they were challenging certain political and social elites more than else. And in a kind of also, I can tell, in historical perspective, in a pretty saying conclusive way, in the sense that if you look at the history of heretical movements, they didn't quite have, I mean, some of them were more intellectuals, others were more social. They all had this kind of phases. Sometimes they were even military movements. This is also something is not often discussed. The heretics, like in general, are passed still throughout our popular culture as the martyrs, the poor sheep that were slaughtered by. But it isn't quite like that. I mean, in terms of personal belief, especially those people who criticize the church as such, like those were people that basically believed the same things, and that in a way or in another, because some of them were objectively innocent, just of being like in the wrong position at the moment in which somebody could take advantage of it, because it was never just the church but also the lay elites that exploited these conditions. And at the time, everything was about religion in a way or in another. Religion wasn't the decisive factor, but it was determinant, and still it was all kind of justified and legitimized politically, ideologically, propagandistically through that. But it was normal, as we've seen at the time, that this would be done in a way or in another. This was just the most influent of those authorities. But in other cases, the heretics were really just not more than martyrs, than people who just wanted to. They said, okay, no more. And they started slaughtering, they started stealing, they started devastating. And those things had to come to an end. And interestingly enough, I believe that these struggles really do not come to an end historically. Like, I believe that there is always kind of an extremistic fringe at the end of the day that will always make noise, and it will be always idealist, uncompromising, radical, violent, and that there will always be an orthodoxy. It will always instead stay for the order, sometimes even at the cost of individuals' freedom, but still giving kind of an order, a direction to society. And we are really like this. I mean, I think human societies are always like this. There's never been an age in which this wasn't the case. It was always the extremistic fringe, as much as there was always the establishment. And this dialectic, as heinous sometimes as it can be, it kind of even helps to probably define the progress that we have, because it generates responses. Like you obviously have to deal with this, so through conflict you grow cleverer. So yeah, this is more or less what I wanted to say today, and I realize maybe it was a bit of a potpourri of, you know, two blended ingredients, but I still think that it's interesting to reflect on this side of the story, and not to be too categorical, as always. Like, you know, if you really want to tell this story from a didactic point of view, you will always find someone will say, oh, well, it was more like in one way, more like in one other. Then, if you really want to get to the point of the question, realize that it's probably impossible even to give a concrete answer, that you can't be so categorical. There are always important exceptions that make structure in turn, right? Well, I will end it here. Okay, for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.